Big crowds, big overtakes, and big off-track arguments. It's fair to say there was a fair bit of drama for Supercars in Sydney this weekend. We had some highs, we had some lows, but overall I found it thoroughly entertaining and I'm keen as to get stuck into everything that went down here on my Round 7 review on Fan at the Fence. Before we pick things apart in detail, let's do a high-level recap on how each of the two races unfolded, starting of course with the first race of the weekend on the Saturday night under lights, and this one got off with Erebus having a fantastic start for both of their drivers. Andre Heimgartner meanwhile had an absolute shocker on the start line, dropping back into the pack. As the race unfolded, we had some really good early race battles. The race did start to quieten off towards the midpoint, which is to be expected, but it all got thrown into chaos again deep into the race when Davey Reynolds actually had a major crash out of shot of any of the TV cameras, registering 38 Gs on the G sensor, and that eventually led to a safety car. Loads of drivers came into the pit lane. That led to one of two controversial penalties from the weekend, with Cameron Waters picking up 5 seconds after an unsafe release into the path of Brock Feeney. Meanwhile, the race got going again and we had some amazing closing lap battles. There was a 4-car battle for the final steps on the podium, which was just spectacular to watch, but it ended in controversy with SVG and Brown coming together ? In the dying moments, and ultimately a post-race penalty, dropping SVG off the podium and giving Brown that 3rd place. We're going to discuss that one in a lot more detail, don't you worry. But meanwhile, out front, it was all about Brody Kostecki. Pretty much, I want to say dominance in the sense he was never really challenged at the front once that race got going, but he wasn't exactly miles up the road either. Nevertheless, he bounced back from a slightly tricky Townsville and put in a good performance for his championship. So Brody Kostecki did take that win, followed by Chaz Mostert in 2nd, and Will Brown took the final step on the podium for that first race of the weekend. Race 2 of the weekend was something of an opposites affair. We had most of the drama actually towards the start of this one, and Andre Heimgartner was also pulling a Uno reverse, this time actually getting a rocket ship of a start from that front row. Meanwhile, one of the championship contenders, Will Brown, had a major issue getting involved in a 4-car tangle at turn 1 on that opening lap and finding himself out in the weeds. He had to fight his way back through the pack in the rest of that race to try and salvage his points for the championship. Meanwhile, at the front, Shane van Gisbergen looked strong from the outset and soon passed Andre Heimgartner for the lead in that opening stint. There were good on-track battles up and down the pack throughout that race, kept things nice and interesting. Meanwhile, Erebus' struggles continued, with Brody Kostecki having a clutch problem which gave him loads of struggles throughout that Sunday race. Just as things started to close down, Anton De Pasquale gave us some entertainment, chasing down a podium position and stealing that one off Brock Feeney, meaning our podium was Shane van Gisbergen out front, Andre Heimgartner holding on to that 2nd, and Anton De Pasquale getting that 3rd place after a hard charge at the end. So how did all that stack up against my pre-round predictions? Well, my poor form continues, with my first prediction being that Chaz Mostert would pick up a victory. This was based on Mostert's fairly strong track record around SMP and WAU's sort of positive signs of a rebound over recent races. It didn't come true though. He got close with that 2nd place on Saturday, but never really looked on for the victory. So it's a negative on the first prediction. And it's a negative on the second prediction as well. I predicted a nightmare weekend for one of the championship contenders. And I said that in order for me to get the tick here, one of those top 4 drivers from either Erebus or Red Bull would have to finish outside the top 10 of both races. Pretty much all 4 guys did encounter problems at some point in the weekend, whether that be mechanical issues, tangles with other cars, or penalties, as we'll discuss later, but all of them did manage to finish inside the top 10 at some point throughout the weekend, so it's another cross on that one. But I am going to give myself a tick for the 3rd and final prediction because I feel that Sydney Motorsport Park did deliver a thrilling race, particularly on the Saturday evening. I know there were some highs and lows, and depending on where your fandom falls, you might feel a bit sour after that one, but for me personally, I loved the drama. It was thoroughly entertaining, and the fact we're still talking about it and debating it, for me, is the hallmark of a memorable race at the very least. So I'm going to give myself that prediction, but I respect it is very subjective. Alright, let's get into the carnage reports. Who found Biff this weekend? Now, as I flagged in my round preview, Sydney Motorsport Park is one of the more generous tracks in terms of runoff, so we didn't see any cars really take damage in practice or qualifying because they do have a bit of a safety net to play with. Of course, when we came to the races though, we did see plenty of tangles, nothing really of note in both races, but race 1 in particular on the Saturday night was a very physical one, and that meant that just about every car had wear and tear after the checkered flag. I think Larko did a bit of a walk, and every car just about had panel damage of some sort. That's what we love touring cars for, right? But the biggest damage at the weekend by far was David Reynolds, who had a huge 38G shunt on the exit of turn 8, I believe it was. We don't have any footage of this one, but it sounds like he might have had some sort of mechanical failure that spat him into the concrete out of nowhere, and that team had a huge rebuild job on their hands for Sunday. The only other real contact of note was actually at the start of race 2 on the Sunday, where we had a 4-car collision on the start between Frosty, Reynolds, Anton De Pasquale, and Brown. Brown was the one that probably found himself worst off out of all of that, going out into the weeds, as I mentioned earlier, at turn 1. But in terms of damage, considering the speeds at that corner, they all got away pretty lightly. And that will bring us to Clash Chat, the part of the show where I pick the most controversial moments from the weekend, discuss it in a bit more detail, and share my personal opinion on the outcome. Now, I can't possibly talk about anything else but that penalty for Shane van Gisbergen after the apparent bump and run on Will Brown for that 3rd place on the Saturday night event. Now, when I first saw this, I was a bit 50-50. I thought it could have gone either way, but the more I've looked at replays, the more I've become pretty entrenched in my opinion on this. So let's quickly recap how this all unfolded. So this all went down on the last lap and about halfway through the lap as well. So stakes were very high on this one. Will Brown was holding what was effectively 3rd place because Cam Waters ahead had a 5-second penalty, and Shane van Gisbergen was in effective 4th place, trying to steal that last step of the podium. Now, Will Brown was doing everything right on the defensive side. He was very assertive and aggressive in his defense, but he wasn't weaving all over the place. He was just hugging the inside of just about every single corner, making sure Shane van Gisbergen just couldn't get a nose up the inside. Now, this all got a bit ugly down at turn 8, where Will Brown once again held that inside line, but this time Shane van Gisbergen gave him a bit of a bump in the rear bumper through that corner, ultimately allowing him to get alongside down that short final straight and take that 3rd position. The stewards looked at this one, and while the cars were pulling into Parc Ferme, decided that that was a bump and run in their eyes, and that Shane van Gisbergen would get a 5-second penalty, promoting Will Brown back up to 3rd. So what do I think about this decision? Well, let me begin by saying I am a big supporter of rules that prevent bump and runs. I don't think it's right that a driver should simply be able to push an opponent out of the way. For me, that's not racecraft. But I do feel like the bump and run rule has been misapplied in this situation. And that's simply just because of the extremes Brown took his defensive tactics to. Now, I think Brown was fair. I think everything he did was perfectly fine, but he did really hug that inside line through turn 8 to the point where he was practically crawling through that corner. And while we don't have the data, thanks to the fact it was a night race, we could really see how long he was on the brakes because of that red glow. And just from me as a fan watching on TV, he still seemed to be on the brakes at a point where most drivers would normally be accelerating out of that corner. If you're holding onto the brake that long, and you're fine-tuned to accelerate at a certain point, and you've got another driver who's ready to do just that on your bumper already, for me, you're just inviting contact at that stage. Had Giz come flying in and given Brown a proper whack in that rear bumper and bumped him wide, I would understand the penalty. Had he almost turned brown on the exit, I would also understand that penalty. But for me, a bit like Brody Kostecki and SVG back in Perth earlier this year, I feel like the two matched each other in their aggression, and that, in my opinion, this was just good hard racing. And I really hope that this incident doesn't set a precedent for future judgments of bump and runs, because if this is how the rule is going to be applied, I feel like that puts way too much power in the hands of the defending driver and could potentially be abused. Let's say, hypothetically, you've got an incident like this one where you've got someone right on your tail that's clearly faster. If you're the defending driver, why not just hold that brake a little bit longer than usual at the next corner and trigger some front to rear contact? Then you can claim it's a bump and run when they do get alongside you and pass you on the following straight. I'm not suggesting that's what Brown was doing in this situation, but it's just an example of the can of worms that could be opened and the gamesmanship that could occur with the drivers in the future if they know the stewards are going to be this sensitive in the application of the bump and run rule. That, of course, is just my opinion, and I fully respect you if you do feel differently about that situation. I did put out a vote, though, to get your read on how you felt about SVG's penalty. 76 people responded. 33% said that yes, SVG did deserve that penalty, but 67%, the majority of respondents, also felt that that penalty was not justified. All right, let's pump up some positivity by talking about the weekend wins, and I want to begin with that big Saturday crowd. It was so good to see that many people at Sydney Motorsport Park to see supercars in action. We had a packed grandstand, we saw heaps of fans on the hill by turn one. It was really, really good to see, and I think just about every event on the season so far has seen a good uptick in crowd numbers. I think the only dip that I've heard about was Tasmania, but that was because they held it in bitterly cold conditions. Hopefully something they rectify for next year. But yeah, good to see those big crowds continue in Sydney. And my second key positive is that I really like the strategic factor in the Saturday race. It was somewhere between a 1 and a 2 stop. We ultimately didn't see that strategy pan out because of the safety car, but I did like that that was a background element, and that even though the racing was fairly tame midway through that race, it was this strategy question mark that was really keeping me engaged. So I like that they set up the format that way, that forced the teams to really make a bold decision on which way they were going to go. And my final key positive is that I feel that Gen 3 cars are able to follow each other so much better over Gen 2. Obviously, we've seen positive signs of this throughout the season, but SMP is one of those more European, fast-flowing circuits where dirty air is more of a factor. And watching some of these onboards, especially through turn 1, I think we can give Gen 3 a big tick for improving the following through fast corners. And what's about the weekend woes, the things that weren't so great? Well, the first thing, and a bit of an ongoing issue with Gen 3, is those steering rack issues. We saw multiple cars hit problems with their steering racks, which is very concerning considering that SMP is one of the more forgiving circuits when it comes to curbs and things like that. And if they're struggling around here, I am scared to see what the situation is like when they get to places like Sandown, Gold Coast, Adelaide. It could be a bit of a nightmare, but it does sound like there is a solution in the works, so fingers crossed we do see an upgrade on the steering racks very, very soon. And my second weekend woe was that Sunday format. As expected going into the weekend, it did feel a little bit underwhelming after the glitz and glamour of the Saturday evening, and just the total lack of supercars running time on Sunday just felt very strange when you consider that most events seem to culminate in that Sunday race. So for me, look, it's a really tricky one with the night racing. I get they're trying to get as many fans through the door as possible, but for me, it just felt way too unweighted. If anything, I would actually like to see the Saturday night the shorter of the two races, because what you lack in length, you make up for in amazing visuals with that night racing format. And then come Sunday, you've got the daytime, which doesn't look as spectacular, but if you've got a longer race with more complications like fuel, etc., they kind of balance each other out, in my opinion. I think Chaz Mostert hit it on the head when he said that if we're gonna do night racing at a round, just do it for both races. I know it's tricky because on a Friday evening, you've got people still wrapping up work. If you do the second night race on the Sunday, you've got people thinking about work the very next morning. So that will impact crowd figures. But I think the value of the whole weekend as a package is just increased so much more if both races are given equal weight. And for me, I think Friday and Saturday evening would be the sweet spot with enough notice. You would think most fans would either be able to figure out a way to finish early or even have that Friday off altogether. I know that won't apply for everybody. And then, of course, Saturday is the weekend anyway. So for me, that's what I would like to see in the future. And I also think it would be really cool to see Supercars take a Friday night slot on TV. But yeah, it is a tricky one. They're still trying to figure out how to make this night racing click. But for me, I would definitely like to see some revisions to the format we saw in Sydney. Okay, let's hand out some awards once again, just personal opinions, starting with my surprise of the weekend. And I'm going to give this one to Bryce Fullwood. Now, I know he didn't necessarily put in a star-studded performance, he didn't get a podium or anything like that, but for me, I'm really impressed with the consistency Fullwood is starting to develop. Brad Jones Racing, they're still something of an underdog team, but Fullwood has really started coming on recently, and it's starting to feel like his strong performances aren't flashes in the pan, they're actually becoming his baseline. So yeah, I was really, really excited to see him starting to do really well in the championship, and hopefully that continues. As for my V7 award, who stuffed up? Well, he didn't drop a cylinder, he dropped some F-bombs. It's gotta be Barry Ryan's live TV rants after that Saturday night race. I know there was a lot of emotion and fan opinion around that whole incident, but I just had a chuckle at a team principal just removing all filters and going in hard on live TV. I was just chuckling because he felt the instant regret that Chad Nailon, who handed the mic to him, had the moment he opened his mouth. So again, I know there's strong emotions around that, but sometimes you just got to step back and laugh at things. Who gave it the Jandal? I'm going to once again give this to Chaz Mostert for his double overtake in the dying moments of that Saturday race. It just looked really spectacular. It kind of reminded me of Danny Rick's double overtake in Baku in Formula 1 all those years ago, and the fact it all happened under lights just made it look so spectacular. And my final award is a special shout out, and I'm going to give this one to Grove Racing. It's easy to underappreciate how much damage was done to that vehicle because the incident wasn't caught on camera, but that team apparently worked to 5 a.m. the next day getting that thing rebuilt. And Chaz Mostert, once again in the presser, actually made a really good point. The late finish on the Saturday night, followed by a more traditional schedule on Sunday, meant that the actual teams were really crunched between the 2 days trying to get the cars turned around, and Grove Racing more than most with that big damage. So big shout out to those guys for getting that car back on track. Overall, I'm going to give this weekend 4 out of 5 stars. After the opening laps of both races, it was pretty apparent who the winner was most likely going to be, but the track action behind them was really, really solid. I've ducked off a star and not given it top marks purely because of that somewhat questionable stewarding here and there, and also that format that, as I said, I think can be improved. But overall, pretty entertaining weekend, and you guys mostly went for 4 out of 5 stars as well, with 58% feeling that way in my post-round poll, although this is one of the more varied poll results I've seen after a weekend of Supercars action, so definitely some varied opinions on how all that went down. I always like to finish up with some thoughts and comments from you guys, and the first one here from Weststar94 says, "It's nice to see a bit of life in the competitors and teams this weekend. The live team radios and the interview with Barry Ryan definitely added some spice." And I think this is a really good point. I know some of the things that were said this weekend have got fans in a spin on, the drivers' feelings towards the series, but I'd much rather be listening to raw, unfiltered opinions than a carefully curated PR machine. So for me, I really enjoy the rawness that brings to the series, and hopefully that's not going to be dialed back at any point, because it makes the sport and the drivers and the characters feel far more accessible and authentic, which I feel you don't quite get from some other series like Formula 1 where things are a little bit more curated. Chris Croft here has shared a few different thoughts, but the ones I wanted to focus on are those questionable penalties. I've already discussed the SVG incident, but I haven't really talked about the unsafe release penalty for Cameron Waters, which also stirred up a fair bit of controversy, and I'm kind of on the fence with it because I haven't seen the data, it's not in front of me, and I think that's ultimately what decides this one. What I do think Supercars could do a little bit better though is try and explain the rules and how they're governed a little bit better. I think there was a lot of confusion over the definition of an unsafe release, whether contact has to happen or a crew member be in danger, or as the results suggested, you just simply can't impede another driver as they're coming into the pits. So I feel like Supercars need to get on the explanations a bit quicker on the live TV broadcast. Repco did do a breakdown on the Sunday, but I feel at that point a lot of fans have kind of made up their minds already, and it's hard to convince otherwise. So I'd definitely like to see, once again, mentioning F1, like a bit more of that live breakdown and analysis where possible, because I think it will help fans understand the sport and how decisions are made. And the other point raised by Chris here is, of course, SVG pretty much confirming he intends to leave Supercars at the end of the year to go racing in America. There's a lot of rumors after Chicago, but I think that one's becoming more and more apparent. I think he's probably just getting things firmed up and in place before he makes the announcement. And the final comment here from Matthew says the weekend was pretty decent, and that he would like to see more night racing in the future. And I would tend to agree with this one. I was a little bit harsh on SMP in my round preview, saying I wasn't a fan of the night racing at these circuits where they light it up to the point where it's almost daytime. And I still stand by that. I do prefer the more temperamental setups like we saw at Barbagallo a few years ago. But with this being the only night race of the season, I was perhaps given the opportunity to still appreciate it a bit more than I have in the past. Even with those bright lights, it still looks spectacular. It was still very different, and I really enjoyed it. Let's finish up with the championship standings, and Brody Kostecki is leading the way by 41 points over his teammate Will Brown. Shane van Gisbergen continues to close up in third place, and Brock Feeney, his teammate, there in fourth. On the team's front, Erebus continue to lead the way, followed by Red Bull, Brad Jones Racing, Tickford, and Team 18. But that will bring my round review to an end. Thank you so much for your patience on this video. Life's just been a bit crazy for me this week, so it has been delayed. But the next round is going to be the Bend Supersprint on August 18 to 20. So be sure to get subscribed if you want to see my round preview for that one. I haven't historically been a huge fan of this circuit, but it looks like they're trying to do some things this year to improve the fan experience. So definitely looking forward to seeing how it all unfolds. But until then, remember to treat people like your trackside down there in the comments. Thank you for your support, and I will see you in the next one.